Good afternoon and welcome to the latest in Flexible Space Association's series of Workspace Wisdom Webinars. I'm Jane Sartin and I run the Flexible Space Association. So today we're looking at the topic of EPCs, which I feel are coming up increasingly in the world of flexible workspace. So it seemed a good topic to cover, and I'm really pleased that we've got Sheaf and John Lorimer from Colliers, who are one of Flex service provider members, to talk us through this topic. So they've got some slides which they're going to take us through. If you've got any questions, if you can put those into the chat box, but we'll pick them all up when they've reached the end of their presentation, and there will be time to add questions then as well. So Aaron and John, I shall get you your presentation and then leave you to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. Thank you. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. So as Jane has kind of very kindly sort of pointed out, John and myself, we're very much involved in the world of EPCs. It's a very, very brief background to our work. We typically work on certification of properties up and down the UK and also across Europe, typically working with clients on a lot of decarbonisation work, and therefore EPCs are constantly the driver behind a lot of what we do. So hence why we're very much involved in all aspects of EPC modelling and providing clients with advice. So this presentation is really a bit of a snapshot into where EPCs MEES compliance currently sits, some of the legislative drivers behind that. We're also going to cover off a little bit about what makes up an EPC and some of the detail that goes into that, and really kind of sort of paint a picture of what you're actually getting when you see one of these certificates and the work that goes in behind that. So John and myself, we're part of the project and building consultancy arm of Colliers. So we're pretty much involved in a lot of acquisition deals and trying to drive and advise our clients on their properties and steps that they can take forward in making the building as marketable as possible. So John and I are both EPC assessors. I've been doing it for longer than I can remember, and John's sort of been involved as an assessor for the last 5 years. Got quite a large catalogue of building types that we've done. We cover all building asset classes and probably done a wide variety of building age and type. So got quite a lot of experience behind us. So EPCs itself. So when we're talking about EPCs for the next sort of 45 minutes or so, the two distinct areas we're looking at, commercial and domestic. And when we're looking at domestic EPCs, we're referring to single family homes. So when we're thinking about student accommodation, we categorize student accommodation typically as commercial. There are little nuances to that, but generally with this presentation, distinction will be that domestic is a single family home, commercial will be everything else. So legislation is really kind of been driven over quite a number of years. The Energy Performance of Buildings Directive was that initial startup period of 2002, where the European Union decided they needed to start improving building efficiencies and performance, and the initial driver behind this was this documentation. So all the EU countries signed up to it with their own individual mandates as to what to do next. Now, here in England and Wales and then also in Scotland, the next document that came up was the Energy Performance of Buildings, 2007. It's quite a bit of time had gone by to get to that point. And then after that, they came up with the energy efficiency, which is MEES. And MEES is really about driving the rental market and the letting market and trying to encourage landlords to improve their assets so that tenants are getting the best they can and reducing their bills ultimately. So that's kind of where the driver came from a legislation point of view. That's very similar in Scotland as well. So England, Scotland, there are nuances to some of the regulations and the requirements. For example, in Scotland, there's no MEES requirement. That may come later on, but currently there's no MEES requirement as it stands. They do have another driver in Scotland whereby buildings of a certain age and type would be required to provide an action plan for improvement. And that typically, we find that occurs in a lot of the acquisition deals that we're doing with clients. So slight differences between England, Wales and Scotland. Northern Ireland is also slightly different. So Northern Ireland uses the same EPC methodology as we do in England and Wales, but they don't have MEES. We're not aware of any changes or upcoming changes to Northern Ireland. That may change in future. So MEES compliance overview. So quite a lot's happened very recently regarding MEES and the requirements. So just a very brief summary of England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. The EPC is required on construction where a building is being sold and where Northern Ireland. Then you've got the MEES aspect to it. So as I mentioned earlier, MEES isn't really applicable to Scotland and Northern Ireland, but it is to England. So currently in England, the minimum requirement is an EPC-E for all lettable spaces. Then you get onto the requirement for that EPC, and in all cases, that EPC for a property that's being sold doesn't have to have a minimum rating. Sometimes it's a little bit misunderstood by everyone thinking that when I'm selling a property, I need to have an EPC. No, you don't. You just need an EPC and a rating. That's what you need for a sale. Where MEES predominantly just kicks in is where there's a landlord-tenant agreement in place, and therefore it may be more relevant. So in terms of timelines, originally the MEES requirement or the MEES proposal was that EPC-E would be the target for all buildings to aim for, and that is where we're at right now. The proposal was by 2027, properties would have to achieve an EPC-C, and in 2030, those properties would have to achieve an EPC-B. The government decided to pull that. The changes that they're now proposing, and this is not legislation yet, but this is what they're proposing, is that by 2031, all privately rented, non-domestic buildings over 1,000 square meters must have an EPC rating of B or above. All privately rented, non-domestic properties below 1,000 square meters would only have to have an EPC of E. The grey area with this that we're finding is the definition of what is 1,000 square meters of a building. Some may view it as being their own individual demise. Typically, what the legislation is always driven by is where a building has been carved up into multiple sublet units. Those multiple sublet units are not classified as this 1,000 square meter area. It's the building itself. So the building footprint is what we think is going to drive this. We'll find out a little bit more going forward, I'm sure, but it is a bit of a grey area at the minute. Now in Scotland, there's a little bit more development going on there. There is an intention to align with the England and Wales approach to EPCs. There are slight nuances to the way those EPCs are modelled in Scotland and in England and Wales. They're not the same, very slightly different. Quite a bit that goes in behind that we haven't got time to explain today, but there are nuances to the way the EPCs are actually modelled. But the plan is to align them a little bit more closely to England and Wales. Whether that happens or not, we'll see. There will be a MEES focus at some point, we believe. The mandate that they're looking at right now is to drive it on the removal of fossil fuel heating systems rather than the EPC itself. So you would still be able to achieve an EPC rating, whatever, it doesn't really make any difference, but the key driver will be, have you removed your fossil fuel heating? And that's where we think the legislation is going to go. Again, none of these have yet been confirmed. We wait to hear more. John, do you want to just run through the domestic side?
Yeah, so the domestic is, again, subject to quite a lot of change. So at the minute, if you look on the left-hand side of that boundary line, we've got EPCE required on all privately rented domestic buildings at the minute. So that's the current MEES status. Now, it's recently been proposed as a part of the Warm Homes Plan that an EPCC will be required by 2030 on all private and social domestic buildings. So social housing wasn't included before, and now it's included in MEES. So that's a key point to consider if that's the line of work that you're in. What's also changing is this RDSAP software and SAP software that you use to model domestic EPCs. It's getting overhauled and replaced with this new software called the Home Energy Model. And that's sort of forming a part of this future building standard and Warm Homes Plan. And what you'll see changing on a domestic EPC is it goes from one single metric to 3 different metrics on the EPC, and that'll include a building fabric rating, sort of services, including like your heating and your hot water, and then a sort of smart building readiness rating, alongside a separate cost information element. So there's some significant changes coming up to how the EPC looks and how it will be portrayed. And so Scotland, at the minute, Scotland doesn't have any MEES for domestic private rentals. It's just an EPC required on sale or lease. In the future, what we are expecting to see is that, again, it's going to be aligned with how England and Wales do it. So this home energy model is going to kind of form part of how the Scottish EPCs are going to be assessed, as well as the England and Wales. So we're expecting there's going to be quite a lot of similarities there. In terms of how and what that actually entails, we don't quite know, because a lot of it's subject to current legislation and sort of reviews and renewals, and further guidance is going to be released. So again, it's a little bit up in the air, but essentially we're expecting it to align with what England and Wales are going to be doing. So this brings us on to EPCs and MEES exemptions. So within exemptions, you've got commercial and domestic exemptions. There's some slight changes in terms of what pathways you can go for, and they're listed on the left. So some of the more common commercial exemptions are the consent, the 7-year payback, and the new landlord exemptions are typically ones we see cropping up quite a lot. But obviously to actually have them exemptions in place, you've got to lodge a non-compliant EPC first, i.e. it's got to be F4G at the current MEES standard. And then you apply for the exemption by the PRS register, and you go about doing that through a sort of formal process where you'd engage relevant people, i.e. EPC assessors or building surveyors, architects, whoever it might be that's related to that exemption. And the process is formalized through a submission to the government database. So it's similar to the actual EPC database, but it's just one purely for exemptions. Domestic, again, yeah, it's the same sort of process really. We've got just some slightly different variances with how they're displayed on the left. So the high cost is one that's kind of changed from the 7-year payback. But generally speaking, they follow the same process, and we'll be expecting these to be in place for the new MEES regulations as well, i.e. the updates for the EPCC for domestic and EPCB for commercial. Right, next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the domestic EPC modelling and how properties are modelled. And this slide kind of just looks at how we model them currently and how we're going to be expecting to do that under the new home energy model. So SAP and RD SAP is the underlying methodology, and that's currently in its 10th variant. It's quite a simple bit of software. A lot of EPC assessors use it on their phone and do the EPC whilst they're on site. There's a lot of standardizations within it and a lot of assumptions that it's made within the software, which does sort of drag its validity to a certain extent. And what that produces for you is one individual compliance metric. Now, the home energy model is going to have 3 compliance metrics plus a separate cost element. So at the minute, the current EPCs give you a single EER rating, which is your energy efficiency rating. And that also includes an element of how expensive it is to run the property. The new home energy model will move away from that being integrated into the compliance. So it'll still give you an indication of how expensive it is or how costly it's going to be, but it'll be a separate metric, and it'll just be for an informative purpose only. So it'll still be there as a good, useful tool, but it won't inform the rating of the EPC itself. So within the RDSAP software, there's fairly limited recognition of new technologies. Had a recent update in June last year that did help that, but it's still not where it should really be, given the government's agenda with how they want to decarbonise the residential stock. So this home energy model is going to look to prioritise that as a separate compliance metric, and therefore bring in a little bit more on battery storage that's not necessarily connected to any renewables. It might be how your property interacts with the grid and how it can use energy at an off-peak supply, i.e. when the grid needs to get energy taken away from it. So that's essentially the key differences in these softwares at the minute. In terms of compliance, so like we said, the key bit is that it's going to have 3 different metrics plus a separate cost element. Now, what's going to happen in terms of the introduction of this is that the existing SAP and RDSAP EPCs are going to be produced up until 30th September 2029. i.e. the 1st of October will then be the home energy model. But the home energy model will be introduced in 2027. So you can start modelling properties in the home energy model next year and lodging them EPCs. But it gives you this sort of grandfathering period between the two where it can kind of trial between the current software and the new software to ensure that property owners have a bit of a buffer and it's not just a huge difference straight away. So there's also the cost cap is going to be increased. So it's currently around £3,000 for that cost cap at the minute to be exempt from these, and it's going to be increased to £10,000. But that's going to be backdated to 2025. So any improvements related to energy efficiency from 2025 onwards that you've done will contribute towards that. I suppose the key point here is that if there's a risk that your property might not perform well in the home energy model, you can lodge it under the current RDSAP software up until the 30th of September 2029, sorry. And that'll give you 10 years validity. Yeah, I think next slide.
Okay, I'm just going to cover off the commercial EPC modelling now, which is quite a bit different from the domestic. So what does an EPC produce? So the EPC typically is providing this energy rating of a building from A to G, and that A to G rating is all being driven by the carbon dioxide that a model is actually producing. So whilst there's energy calculations are being done in the background, but the key metric for that A to G rating is the carbon emissions. Okay, so that's what's driving the rating. Who can provide an EPC? Well, so typically where an EPC is provided on construction to be sold or rented out, the same type of EPC assessor can be used throughout that process. There isn't any bias with the transaction trigger requirements, but there are different varieties of EPC levels. So level 3, level 4, level 5 is really being governed by the complexity of the building type. And as an EPC assessor, when we're looking at a building, when we're trying to provide quotations, when we're providing advice to our clients, we're always assessing the building complexity and trying to align it with the right software tool. So typically, a level 3 and level 4 assessment will be done in simplified building energy model software, which is predominantly sort of almost like a database-driven piece of software. The level 5 tends to be what we would class as a dynamic simulation model. And the difference with that is that where you've got a building that has got multiple connected zones that may be open, or such as an atrium, where you've got nighttime cooling, where you've got some really advanced and complex ventilation systems, the level 5 software will need to be required, because you've got conduction gains and losses, convection gains and losses. You've got air movement needing to be considered, and only a more powerful tool, software tool, is going to be able to calculate that for you. So again, that's something that we kind of try to determine on a job-by-job basis. There are cost differences between those as well. There are also pros and cons to do one or the other, and that's really about the detail of the EPC software and what more information might actually be required to be inputted into that. So there are various software packages. Here in Colliers, the dynamic simulation software we use is IES. IES doesn't just do EPC modeling, it does a lot more. We can do heat and cooling load analysis, thermal comfort analysis, lighting design analysis, rise to light assessments. So it's a very powerful tool. The more simplified version of softwares that we currently use are GIS-BEM and Elmhurst, and they're sort of almost like database. And with Elmhurst, it's actually an online tool that you can use. And that's not to diminish its complexity. There's still a lot that goes into that. There's a lot of calculations, lots of algorithms built into it, but its interface is a little bit more simplistic. Typically, it's a lot easier for a small building type to be done on those more simplified software. So the EPC guidance and legislation, kind of what I wanted to lean on to now is hopefully most of you will be familiar with an EPC and what it looks like, this A to G rating piece of paper. What goes in behind that, the amount of effort and time and factors that we as assessors need to be aware of is perhaps not really understood or even known. And so this sort of list that I've got there on the right hand side paints a little bit of a picture of what there is. So as assessors, we have got to make sure that our EPCs are aligned to the EPC conventions first and foremost. There's 47 pages, there's 50 assessment rules. Every time we do these assessments, we're having to be mindful of everything we do and all the data input that's going into that to make sure it's compliant with those requirements. Our accreditation bodies will from time to time audit our work to make sure that we are meeting the required standard for an EPC assessor. So we are effectively policed, which is good for everyone. It maintains standards and hopefully maintains a level of quality that's acceptable to everyone. Beyond that, we've got the national calculation methodology. This is a 62-page document that outlines to the software developers and providers what they need to be aligned to in order to have their software approved as an EPC software. There's a lot of calculations and lots of requirements built into that to ensure that each software house is producing the same thing as best as possible. You do get nuances, but that document is really there to ensure that there is almost like a level playing field. We're also very, very mindful of building regulations and all variants of building regulations. with every single building, it will always be built to a slightly different standard. As assessors, we have to be mindful of that. If a building's been built in 1970, we have to go back to the regulations at the time and consider what fabric factors and performance levels may have been attributed to that building at that time. We take into account refurbishments. Details and information is really important to inform us of that, but fundamentally we are using building regulations as almost that initial reference point. And in addition to that, the sort of building regulations from 2006 onwards will also include a tertiary guide, which is the non-domestic building service and compliance guide, and this outlines all the performance requirements for mechanical, electrical building services. And we are also referring to all of that information or being mindful of it when we do these EPC assessments, because we want to make sure that we're getting the right efficiency and the right input parameters into our model so we get the best and most accurate EPC rating possible. Now, there are multiple software types, as I mentioned earlier. Each one of those software types will also have hundreds and hundreds of pages of user guides and manuals on how to use the software. The point of all this is that there's a lot of variety and variation that goes into these EPCs, and quite often tend to find that clients will query one EPC versus another EPC from the same building site and say, well, why has it changed? Why have I had a D and now I've got an E? What's happened? And this type of information can lead to that from time to time. So it's something we're always mindful of when we're trying to advise our clients. So EPC modeling, so what factors are really affecting that EPC rating? Software, as I mentioned earlier, building orientation. So we will position the building and rotate the building to reflect exactly where it is positioned in the UK. So that has an impact on things like solar gains, which will directly then impact heating and cooling. That directly impacts the carbon emissions of the building. So it has an important factor. Building age, as I mentioned earlier, with the building regulations is really important. Defines what the building fabric performance might be, which will in turn impact the heating gains and the cooling loads, and therefore impacting EPC rating. Glazing ratio is really important. So when we're modelling up these buildings, we are trying to produce a one-to-one scale within our software. So we're inputting all the building positions, the windows, to try and accurately reflect the building as it is. Occupancy profile. So it's important that we define the right occupancy for different areas. We tend to find that building types are affected by the EPC rating. So if you've got a warehouse and a workshop, they will perform slightly differently when it comes to the EPC. So it's very important that we define the activity correctly. Heating fuel types, a huge driver, particularly now that the decarbonisation strategy and demands that the government put on everyone is there. Fossil fuels are something that are slowly being phased out, and the plan is to phase them out to improve the EPC ratings to drive us towards this net zero carbon commitment that we are all committed to, and that's a factor within these EPCs as well. Also, lighting and ventilation are also important factors in an EPC model.
So the key points, and just kind of to summarize today's presentation, so the key elements for a good rating on EPC can relate to quite a lot of the points that Aaron was just discussing there, but there's some of the individual points that we're looking to flag up is the asset type and use class. That does vary quite significantly. So if you've got a workshop and an industrial warehouse or logistics building that have similar sort of heating systems, the use class of them individual zones within the individual buildings does impact the overall energy use prediction and subsequent emissions within the software. So you can get some variances between the two. And that there's also examples that you can look at student accommodation, hotels, and how their domestic hot water load interacts with the EPC software. Quality of building fabric data and the availability of all these building services pieces of information, so the heating, cooling, lighting, ventilation, hot water, and renewables, that is all significant to an EPC. So the more information you have on all of them elements, the better the better chance you have of getting a more accurate and usually a better rating, because you're overriding the defaults that the software uses, or the things we've used from the building regulations at the time of that individual building. So that's quite a significant one to look at if you're going to get a good EPC baseline rating before you go into looking at any improvement works. Decarbonisation strategy. So that is currently more focused at the commercial software, because the existing residential software has this cost element built into it, and electric is currently a higher cost per unit than gas. So it doesn't quite form as favourably in that. So that's just one to consider at the minute, but that's going to be tackled in the home energy model. But generally speaking, decarbonisation in the commercial software is a benefit. So if you've got gas or oil-based systems or LPG-based systems, you're decarbonising them, that's generally going to be good for your EPC. Building-specific operational considerations. There's quite a lot, but there's the two key ones that we kind of pick out on is the supermarket cooling. So if you actually have cooling on the shop floor, i.e. like where the groceries are in a supermarket, it tends to perform worse because it's more energy intensive. When you take that out of the cooling out of the shop floor, it actually has a better impact on the EPC rating. And that's because it has assumptions that the cold storage areas have some cooling input into the actual shop floor itself. And you also reduce that overall load. The coordinated implementation of the improvement measures is very significant. So it varies between building use class and asset type as to the impact of them. But generally speaking, when you coordinate 3 or 4 more improvement measures, you get a better result, because each time you change something in an EPC, the sort of boundaries change it because of how the EPC is calculated. It's all calculated by a comparison to the notional building. So when you change one thing, it then looks at a different notional building within the stock. Oh, I think I skipped a slide, sorry. So benefits and limitations of EPCs. We always say EPC is a really good baseline to start looking at your energy efficiency and where you can look at targets or improvements in that. However, it doesn't capture your operational energy use, like how we're using this room right now or how the rest of the floor is going to be using. It's going to vary between room and area. An EPC doesn't do that. It's got set parameters within that use area. So you can't utilize the energy use on an EPC as the be-all and end-all of your operational energy use. It will differ if you compare it to your energy bills. An EPC enhances property value and marketability in most cases. An improved EPC rating will generally attract tenants because it aligns with goals. It's a compliance perspective, from a compliance perspective as well, sorry. And it's a general, people use it as a tool of saying, actually, that's a pretty good building because it's got an EPC B or an EPC A from the base build. And it's then looking at how they can use that from there. However, when you look at how an EPC is sort of come about, there is an element of subjectivity within that in terms of how you assess the building. If you haven't got any evidence to prove that it's a certain age or certain services, you have to make some assumptions. So there is subjectivity between that, and that can vary between assessors. And that also leads into the fact that, like, the assessor does dictate how valid the EPC is. So if you pay as low a fee as possible for an EPC, you're going to get that reflected within the actual rating. So there's definitely benefits and shortfalls to that. So overall, the EPC and MEES appraisal we offer as a service within Colliers. We've got two main services within that band. So there's the high-level EPC validation, which includes a site survey and a review report, and that gives you a good indication of where your EPC is currently at, based on our similar experiences of other buildings and engineering judgment. We'll then offer a pathway to get to X or like A or A+ or B rating within that report, and some costed items there as well. The difference between the modelled and the high level is that the modelled actually gives you an updated baseline EPC. So that'll have your B rating or your C rating and your number as well. So it might be a C55, and then we'll do some uplifts to get it to a B or an A. And that'll give you some certainty in what you can then spend on in terms of the asset. The takeaways for you and anyone and your clients that you might know and deal with. So we've got the new MEES for domestic and non-domestic properties. So domestic being 2030 EPCC required for private and social housing, and non-domestic being EPC-B required for buildings over 1,000 square meters by 2031, and EPC-E for anything under that by 2031. Domestic EPC software has been updated and replaced with the home energy model by 2029, and you've got up until the 1st of October 2029 to lodge any EPCs under the current software. It's constantly evolving industry, and it's sometimes difficult to be aware of all that going on. So it's really worth engaging with someone who knows what they're talking about in these updates and legislation. So we're expecting more guidance, more consultation responses coming up. So it's constantly evolving. We would recommend on the back of that to do initial portfolio reviews on assets that you may have or operate, and that just identifies any compliance and potential CapEx risks in the short and medium term. As a separate point on the EPCs, so I touched on it before with the 15th of June date. That was a key date for the carbon factors being updated. So essentially any EPC done prior to that date, we tend to write off as its validity is no longer there because of the carbon factor change. So that's something to be very aware of. And on the back of that, if you've got a building that's up for refurbishment, it's always worth reviewing the EPC to see what other elements you can include to maximize that rating. Because that might be easy wins within that can just be incorporated as a part of the refurbishment package. And I suppose connecting to that as well, it's with the recommendation report produced by an EPC, we wouldn't recommend you to rely on that to upgrade your EPC result because of the discrepancies and the limitations of that report. It tends to be automated and may not be building specific. And as a last key point is that tenant process equipment doesn't impact EPC ratings for the most part. So if you've got industrial elements to your properties and you might have a line or some sort of packing unit or a blast furnace, for example, we wouldn't look at the efficiencies of that. That's just not included. An EPC just looks at internal comfort conditioning.
So the full slide deck will be issued, I believe, by Jane, and that includes some case studies that we've got, various building types that you can sort of obviously take a look at. So I suppose on to questions really. If there's any questions at all.
Okay, thank you very much. We've just preempted one of the questions, which was, can we have the slides? So that was that was an easy one. So yes, you've agreed with that. Thank you. So we have got a few questions in, and if anybody else would like to add any, there's still a few minutes to do that. Let's just bring us back onto the screen. So first one is, does having a listed building act as an exemption still?
No, never did. It never did.
Oh, okay.
There was certainly an idea by everyone that a listed building was exempt from the requirements. It's not. There's still an expectation that you try to do something UPC and you improve it. That's never gone away. It's just, it's been a little bit of a grey area, and it's probably been communicated poorly. It's got better as the legislation has sort of evolved a little bit. Currently, they still fall under the MEES requirements. Now, what you tend to find is that there are more exemptions available, and that's what we tend to find. There are more exemptions available for those building types. You can't do anything about the walls. You've already done everything internally. You then demonstrate that I've done everything I can. That's an EPC F. So that tends to, yeah, I'll take away on it.
Okay, and I think there are perhaps a surprising number of flexible workspaces that are in listed buildings. I was in one just a couple of weeks ago, and the centre manager was talking about the difficulties of being able to do things that they might otherwise quite like to do.
Absolutely,
but they're lovely buildings to be in.
Yeah, but we do a lot. Yeah, we do a lot of heritage work as well, and it's extremely challenging. We totally get that. It's just trying to find those easy win solutions, which is kind of what we do. And it's not necessarily the heavy work.
That's where the consent exemption would really come in.
Yeah.
So if you did have a listed building, say for example, the only way you could improve it was to overhaul all the windows, and you went to the planning authority with that, and they said no because it's going to impact the character of the building, then that's the exemption. So you've got that heritage element in there. So the listed building doesn't directly have the exemption in place. It's just the consent.
But there's ways of getting at least an understanding of why things can't be done. Okay, next, if you are a certified green energy user with electric heating, would that qualify for you as being fossil fuels free?
No. Again, this is quite common. That question comes up. No. So that helps for other metrics, other sort of measuring the means of your carbon emission reporting and things like that. That does aid those sorts of things. EPC is not concerned about that. Really, what EPC is really driving is that, are you using the energy in your building as efficiently as you can? Doesn't matter where the energy's come from, but am I using it as efficiently as I can? And that's really what the EPC is doing. Whilst it is built on a carbon emissions metric that I mentioned earlier, it is really about the building energy. So the important thing is, how do I make my building more energy efficient? New windows, insulation, better efficiencies in equipment. That's what it's really interested in.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got a couple of questions that we had submitted in advance, which I have already shared with you. The first of which is quite long, so I'm not going to read it all out, but I've just put it up on the screen. How do you balance the compliance elements of energy and performance? Can you comment on that one?
Yeah, so quite a few points in this, and I'm glad you sent it through, actually, because I have to think about it. So it's a challenge. It's an ongoing challenge that is not easily resolved. So if you just take the first part of that, so how do you balance compliance elements with energy performance? But ultimately, you've got to decide right from the outset what your design philosophy is. What is it you're trying to achieve first? You've got to make sure that your building is going to provide the environment that it needs to provide, and design it on that basis. As assessors, what we would then do is kind of take that information on board and try to replicate that within an EPC model and say, right, this is what I'm getting, this is where I'm at. And then a conversation then needs to occur between the two parties and say, well, okay, what do I need to do to make it better? It's that almost that connection point between the two is really important. And I know that's not always, I know from experience that's not always easy to achieve. And ordinarily, time is the factor in a lot of this. In an ideal world, you try and provide a sufficient amount of time for that piece of work to occur and that coordination to occur. I think that's really important. Second bit of that question. So refurbished buildings and new construction is an element of compliance. saying we need to ensure there is enough fresh airflow in the building. The M&E design spec, very high-end systems that feeds a lot of fresh air, utilise a lot of energy. This causes imbalance on temperature, which kicks out aircon systems to wall space, etc. How are the two systems departments working together, work together to get the best outcome? My background is as a mechanical engineer, and the business I used to work in, and this is how relevant this is. Business I used to work in, we were an energy department we're in a much bigger M&E contracting firm, and I kind of stepped away from the design aspect and let designers do their bit. Even within a company under the same roof, it was always a bit of a challenge. You're ultimately being driven by the requirements of the building and the design, and then you've got to then try and communicate that back to the assessor and say, right, give me what I need under these conditions. And then I might go back and say, well, this is the result of it. Once you've established all of that, once you've designed it, great. Then you get into the post-occupancy period. And that's where things like this start going wrong, because the designer would have designed it for a specific purpose. The assessor would have assessed it based on that specific purpose. But then actually, when it comes to the operation, it might change. It might be there's more people in the office, or there's less people in the office. It might be that the desk positions are slightly different from what it was designed to. Straight away, you get this imbalance occurring. It happens so much. And I know it from experience in this building that we're in now, same issues. It's really important to have a really good BMS system. It's really important to ensure that buildings are being maintained and the operations are being looked at carefully, regularly. I don't think we, UK-wide, we're very good at that. I think that's the one thing we're really not driving very well, I think, personally, is the actual maintenance, care and operations of our buildings. A lot of these buildings do have that, but there are inherent issues, and you've got to understand what those issues are. And it might be you've got to tweak some of the set point parameters, make sure you get the right balance at the right time. It's very challenging. It's always going to be challenging, unfortunately. And the other thing is that perception of heat and cooling between two people is different. So how do you satisfy that? John should wear a jumper because he's cold, and I'm happy as I am. But you can't dictate his policy. It's very difficult, very challenging. I used to do a lot of analysis, thermal comfort analysis, and you do tend to find even sort of male and female requirements are vastly different. So what do you do? Move people around in an office? Maybe. It's challenging. All you could do is design it to the best of your abilities and try to operate that building in accordance with that design. That's what I would suggest.
I think it's a common from anybody that's ever worked in an office with a number of colleagues will know that problem of whether it's genuinely too cold or too hot. Right, another. How do you track, monitor, or police the energy performance in a building once certificate is issued, other than recertifying every 5 or 6 years?
We don't. The responsibility of that really falls with the owner of that EPC. Essentially, although the EPCs are available to everyone, it's public information. Really, it's the recipient of that EPC. So whether it be the landlord or building owner, or even a tenant in some cases, they're kind of the custodians of that EPC. So if they want to monitor it, police it, and do anything with it, it kind of falls under their responsibility. Now, I could go to any building owner and tenant and say, you've got an EPC needs to be doing, here's my fee to upgrade it, and these are reasons why to do it, why you should do it. But I don't know as if that's really an aggressive tactic that a lot of EPC assessors use. We certainly don't use that. We're kind of looking for clients to come to us and seek the advice, not the other way around. So it's really down to those owners of the EPC really that should be sort of tracking and monitoring and policing it. The difficulty you get is that at what point do you do it? And this is something that I think everyone kind of doesn't really fully understand or appreciate, and that's completely understandable because we're the guys that do know that. We know why you need an EPC and when you need EPC. The owners of that EPC might not. So typically where you're doing significant building works that might be extending your heating, cooling and ventilation, or maybe having significant impact to your building fabric, there's an opportunity there to look at the EPC, and perhaps we knew it, because you really want to understand what impact is this piece of work actually going to have. And even if it's a quick chat with one of us, guys like ourselves, who might turn around and go, okay, I hear what you're saying, but the work you do, it's not going to have any impact. Just having that one-to-one conversation with somebody who knows would always be a good idea. But that's there isn't any one place in it, fundamentally.
Yeah.
It tends to be more like solicitors at a transaction or a lease event that will say, actually, you haven't got an EPC in place or an EPCE in place. Yeah. That's when it gets flagged up. And it's the same with lenders as well. A lot of lenders now offer mortgages or loans to properties with a certain EPC rate. And if it falls below that, they will have a higher interest rate or won't lend the money. So it tends to fall with the solicitors. The government have kind of took a step back, and it kind of gets enforced by solicitors through lease events, which is why you have the issues of building upgrades. It doesn't really get renewed. It tends to happen as and when the leases are new.
If you go back to the requirement for an EPC, construction, sold, let, those three triggers is really the point where someone gets involved at some point to then flag that an EPC needs to be or could be renewed. And in some cases, we know that can have a positive impact on the marketability of your building, and it's just being very mindful of that at each stage.
Yeah. Okay. Last couple of questions. For properties under 1,000 square meters, does it need to be EPC-C, or was it still EPC-E by 2031?
EPC-E. So the floor area is completely irrelevant where it stands currently right now, with one exception. So the minor exception is that a standalone building, 50 square meters or less, doesn't need an EPC. So the floor area isn't really a factor in that currently.
Okay, final question, which is quite specific, and I'm also mindful that we are sort of running quite a bit over on time. So I think this probably is one you could be a long answer to, but maybe try be not too long. We have a building which would require significant capex to get it to an EPC-C. This capex is out of our budget. Any suggestions on how to deal with this scenario?
Okay, but I'm selling my services right now. I'll say, how do you know that's correct? Has your assessor actually looked at any sort of low-cost scenarios? There's always opportunities to investigate what you've got in your building before you actually go and do work. So have you got the right lighting information in there? So rather than just looking at light and going, it's an LED and I tick a box, what's the actual performance of that light? Put that information in. Same with all the other pieces of equipment. Is there anything in there in that baseline model that are perhaps default parameters, because they're quick, easy wins there potentially, and then you establish a more accurate baseline rating, and then you kind of figure out, okay, where do I go next? In terms of the actual improvements at EPC, all buildings are different. This is the trouble. That could be an office, or it could be an industrial unit, and my answer would be very different for both. So
I think it'd be an office.
Very specific. So from an office point of view, you are looking at kind of usage type and usage areas. Look at the hot water side of things. Is it even relevant? But it's really going to be really down to the detail of what you've got. And like I say, I would focus on how much of the parameters in that model are already defaults. Have I got everything in there that I can? So it might be just a little bit more investigating work, which will be a lot lower cost than perhaps what your CapEx is. That would be my first suggestion.
Okay, thank you. So hopefully a better scenario maybe than it might look at first, worth having a bit more investigation.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, well, thank you very much, Aaron and John. We've packed an awful lot of information into there. As we said, we will share the slides, but we'll also share a recording as well, so that if people want to review any bits or share it with colleagues, etc., we'll do that probably a bit later today. Thank you very much again. We will have more Workspace Wisdom webinars coming up, working on a couple of thoughts at the moment. If anyone has any topics they'd like to see covered, please do let us know. Be great to have some thoughts on things that we haven't done. There's quite a bank of them now, but I'm sure there's more to do. So thank you again, and goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.